have bad news.
What?
We've been having a lot of rational conversations here, trying to philosophically and theologically arrive at positions of truth. We've been doing it all wrong.
You're kidding.
No, it's the truth.
That's how I survive, is by rationale. Rationale is how I survive. Come on, John.
Yeah, right. It's how we've all survived up until now. But we wanna try to shift gears a little bit because it turns out all we're arguing about, all we're talking about, is how rational discourse and rational understanding doesn't lead where we want to go, doesn't lead us to the truth that we're seeking, and so that means that we are the very enemy that we've been fighting against.
No.
You ruin everything, John. Welcome to The Sacred Life. I am your host, Aaron Beachy, coming to you from the backwoods of Indiana somewhere. And
Somewhere.
today we have with us John Baylor and David Baylor again. And the three of us are finally back together after a long
Arduous journey.
hiatus, journey through the wilderness, whatever you want to call it. But we're glad to be back with you today and resume the three of us doing some recordings together. Today we're going to be talking about maybe a new approach, kind of storytelling. John, you want to kind of introduce this and tell us why we've been doing it all wrong?
Okay. Well, I already told you why we've been doing it all wrong.
Well, tell us more.
Yes, tell us more.
A lot of our project has been like an anti-enlightenment, anti-rationality, anti-modernism kind of project, and part of the discussion has been that as we have rational discussions, not just that's kind of the way that I framed it in the intro before, but it's like if we can just say, hey, I believe in this list of beliefs, then we're good and we're good Christians, and what matters most is like the knowledge that we hold inside of our heads. And again, that's a modernist, that's a rationalist way of thinking. Like what's most important is what I can rationally grasp. But in arguing against that, we also want to be able to move away from it. And the primary alternative, and the way that people have approached truth and understanding themselves and their role in the world in the past, is mostly through story and through symbolism, rather than through sort of abstract ideas that we say that we assent to. So as we approach the topic, there are a few things that I want to touch on here. And one is just laying out, okay, if I keep saying rational discourse, and there's a problem with rational discourse, we want to understand what is wrong with that. We want to move into talking about the purpose of storytelling, and in particular, storytelling's relationship to knowledge or meaning. And my own kind of angle in this is storytelling's relationship to your identity as a person. Sorry, your identity as a person. And then we can look at a few different types of storytelling as well and how they work. And obviously, we'll talk some about biblical stories and the kind of impact that they have on the soul of a person. Hagiography, or that would be the lives of saints, or Christian legends. And then I'll have a few comments, I think, just generally in relation to epic storytelling, or older forms of storytelling, and the role that those played in society, or the role that those played in the lives of the individual. So that's some of the ground that we'll cover. And David, since I've been talking so much about problems with rational thinking, I think I'll just have you develop the idea a little bit.
Well, I think the big thing for me is, how do we actually relate to the world around us? How do we actually relate to meaning? So we discuss. So there's the weakness in what we've been doing so far, and I should add to this. It's never been our intention from the outset to strictly focus on this more rational, philosophical side of things, like so directly, but to incorporate these other things.
Actually, we've had a lot of conversations privately about this sort of contradiction in what we're doing.
Right.
And some of the reason that we do this, that we approach it through rational discourse, is just because we don't know how else to communicate with people.
Right.
And what I mean, I don't just mean that we don't know how to say anything else, but we also don't know how people will receive anything else.
Yeah. Right. And so that's the question is, okay, how do we as humans actually receive meaning? And it's probably not through having like a long list of explanations. And it's like I myself fall into this error very often of like trying to lay out the complete argument for something. And then I find like, well, when I do that, then it just becomes burdensome and confusing. But if I don't do that, then people will take what I'm saying and get something completely different out of it. And so it's like, well, okay, it seems to me there's a problem here. What I'm doing doesn't actually accomplish what I'm setting out to do. So how do we as humans, the way we are created, the way we operate, how do we actually derive meaning? And the answer that you and I and that, well, really humans for the entire history of humanity has come to is that it's through story and through symbolism. So it's like I have a story that demonstrates the message that I'm trying to portray. And like the Bible is the best example of this. Like the Bible pretty much never like lays out a description of Christianity, for example, or even in the Old Testament, the Bible like pretty much never, even the Torah doesn't actually lay out a prescriptive set of like doctrines
a
and
beliefs
beliefs.
or like a systematic theology.
Yeah, right. Like it doesn't do that. And
Yeah, actually, I mean, even the term systematic theology is like there are a couple of really old examples of systematic theologies that we kind of go back and we apply that term to.
Yeah.
But it's actually the idea of a systematic theology is a modern idea.
Well,
even
so
the idea of an essay. This is something that's popping in my mind. For a literary historian, you might say that the essay begins with Montaigne in the 1700s.
yeah,
And you know, if you look at like the epistles of Paul, then I think there are times when you can say, well, he's a little more essay-like than most of the Bible is. So you could kind of dispute that and say, well, no, the essay does go back to ancient times, but yet you would still have to kind of concede that the essay itself is a modern phenomenon. This
Right.
idea of like just having the abstract rational discourse.
Yeah,
You know,
and
I say that we've got like, you know, like Plato and Aristotle and the philosophers. You know, like they're certainly engaging in rational discourse, but we had this modern explosion of rational discourse.
right. And like the first, like you're talking about systematic theology. The first thing in Christianity that's actually considered systematic theology is not until the 8th century. That's John of Damascus. And even he relies heavily on illustration to make his points, like in a way that a modern systematic theology would not.
Yeah.
But if you go before him, like the best example of this would be Saint Basil the Great. If you read what he's saying, like he's just like pure illustration to relate his points. So like one of his famous works is he's talking about why Christians should actually read the great works of pagan literature before them, and to make his points he uses illustrations from that literature that he's talking about. So like here's what Odysseus did, and this illustrates why you should, like, you know, like I think the example is like Odysseus, when his sailors were sailing by the island with the sirens, had all of his men stop up his ears, but had them tie him to the mast so he could still hear them, but he wouldn't be able to like go and throw himself on the rocks like everybody else did because he was tied up. And he's saying like this is an illustration of the thing that I'm talking about. Of like you should, you know, his point is you should be reading these stories but carefully.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and using the story there is like the story is what tells you what
Right.
kind of person to be.
Right. And yeah, and that's like his point there, which like really honestly this whole discussion could just be based on that
Yeah.
on that work of exposition. I don't know what you'd call it, that work of literature. But yeah, I guess the broader point is just that it's not that the discussions we've been having are useless. They're very useful, but you're not actually going to connect with the meaning unless you somehow see it in action. Because like you relate to meaning. I mean, I guess I ruined my analogy by saying you relate to meaning, but it's relational. It's meaning. You come at meaning by how these things relate to you, relate to the world around you, how they operate. And like that's actually like an important concept in traditional Christianity. Like this is why traditional Christianity has such an emphasis on our faith being incarnational, which is something I think a lot of people, a lot of modern Christians don't understand. But like incarnational means like the truth, the logos of God is manifest in our world, and because that's the case, you can't relate to it merely in a theoretical way.
Right. So would it be fair to say then that a healthy relationship with storytelling or stories is severely lacking amongst especially adults these days?
I think
Well, my quick answer to that would be that we've relegated the good stories to something for children,
right.
Yes, that's
which is like they are for children. Like you should be raising your children, but they're for you as an adult also.
Right.
Like
Well,
you don't grow out of them.
They are for children in a particular way because stories are about identity formation.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that adults are also in the
Right.
process of identity formation. Like if you become crystallized and you're no longer experiencing personal transformation, well, then you could say then you are dead. So like the story is for somebody who's still living and who's still growing and undergoing transformation.
one of the things I think that's most interesting to me about how an adult can relate to a younger child is to experience a story together.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's actually quite powerful.
Yeah, right.
Well, and so like I
Well,
think
here,
of like
if there's a story, then,
sorry.
No, not
don't
necessarily.
interrupt because you just made the abstract point, but
Yeah.
you could illustrate this.
Well, I was
going
gonna make a story.
Yeah.
Well, I guess just to take it a little further, I recently got married and now have four children. And I'm not going to
That
go
was
into intense details about that, but one of the things that I have connected with them on and strongly is actually listening to or reading stories together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like you cannot put into words how that connection happens, but suddenly when dad gets ready to go down the road to run an errand, I want to go along so we can turn a story on and listen to it together.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the experience is something that is quite powerful,
Right.
and it actually makes life make more sense.
Mm-hmm.
And you cannot read that into existence, so to speak. You can't rationalize that into existence.
Well,
I would say with my kids, especially my daughter, who gravitates towards stories a lot more than my son does, and he likes a story. But like if we go to the library and pick out some videos to watch, then he wants to watch videos about John Deere tractors, and so like he's really not that interested in like storytelling TV shows or things like that, and he's not as interested in story time as what my daughter is. But like I say, he likes it. He's not like poo or anything like that.
Right.
But there are other things that
He's more of a man of action.
he is, right. But especially with my daughter, in the act of reading stories, I would say I can understand strengths of my daughter better in reading stories than I can at other times.
Yeah.
I see values coming out in her that you do see in action, and you hear about when she's telling about the way she handles situations with friends at school or something like that. So like you obviously you pick up somebody's values by the way they live their life.
Yeah.
But in a way you really see it in noticing how she responds to a story.
Yeah, exactly.
The thought that came to my mind when you were sharing that is like, well, that very closely relates to why it is that like wisdom and understanding in the Bible are represented in feminine terms instead of masculine.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you see that in children.
Yeah. Well, there's also this sense of like it's in this undefinable realm of the story that you understand it. Like
Yeah.
if you could sit down and you could say like, all right, now tell me what do you value about this? How would you behave in this situation? And then you could like take notes or like check boxes to identify like, okay, now I can tell you what kind of personality you have or something. I mean, we do have personality tests like that.
Right.
But there's a sense in which like the real essence of it doesn't come from that clear cut approach, but the real essence of it comes from story. And I mentioned me as a parent seeing the values of my daughter more during story time than other times. But I've kind of mentioned it already, but I will really stress in the conversation that stories are about identity formation. And if I as a parent see the values of my daughter coming through when the main character is in a certain situation or does something that they shouldn't have done or something like that, and then she responds to it, then now how she responds is kind of like it's out there in the open, it's in this space between me and my daughter, and I can interact with it. I can deal with her values, and I can let her know where what you're thinking right now is a good way of thinking, and then she can grow in that.
Yeah.
And you could do the opposite and say it's a bad way of thinking, but a good story is going to bring out her good ways of thinking about things.
Right.
Yeah.
But that allows me as the storyteller to play a role in shaping who my daughter grows up to be.
Yeah. Like another example of that was one instance I had with one of my daughters was one of the characters in a certain story that we were listening to was just kind of a jerk. And she kind of made the either me or her made the comment that she's just kind of a little bit of a jerk, and we just laughed together about it, and then started talking about the character and how irritating it is sometimes and things like that. But you start to be able to have those types of conversations about life and how life is, and how you look at things through things like that, rather than sitting down and saying, now this is how it is, this is how you must do things, and this is how you must think about things.
Right. Which, I mean, there's a place for that.
There is.
I mean, like,
there is.
There's and you could say that's a very fatherly thing to do, is to like sit down with your kids and say, look, you're not going to act this way, you're going to act this way instead. That's also part of identity formation too. And when I say like, I'm talking about this in terms of my experience, and my wife plays this role a lot more than what I do in terms of like reading the stories and responding to what my daughter's saying. And I do a lot of it myself, but it is more something that she does more than what I do.
I think this is a little bit changing. Actually, before I say that, I want to say, like, when I so rudely was interrupting Aaron earlier, like the thing that I was going to say is I never knew my great-grandfather, like my great-grandpa Baylor. Like, I never knew the man. I don't, like, he wasn't alive during my lifetime. Like, he died years before I was born. But I've heard so many stories about him that I feel like I knew him. It's like I have a relationship to this man who died decades before I was born. And it's like, why is that? Like,
well, he wasn't decades before, but
well, I mean, maybe. I don't know. It was a long time. It was years anyway. I mean, but it's like, why is that? How can I feel like I have this? Like, I do, like, in reality, have a relationship to this man,
Right.
Because like he's my great grandfather. But like personally, it's like it's almost as if like you and I have developed a relationship to this man through the stories. And I guess this actually does kind of segue neatly into where I was going. It's like, I don't know, this is like kind of the error of iconoclasm. If you walk into, like, I've had the privilege of being inside of some medieval parish churches in Central Europe where they still have the medieval iconography painted on the walls. Now, like in the case of several of these, they survived because the Reformation plastered over them, and then in like the 90s they restored them or something like that. But it's just like seeing these things painted in like the 14th century, 15th century. But it's just like, it's stories.
right.
And like you think about that, it's like, well, the people in the Middle Ages, like it's not true that people in the Middle Ages were all just ignorant and illiterate, but a lot of them were illiterate. But also, like, even if they weren't, like, before the printing press, you can't afford a Bible. Like, you just can't. Like, you could save up your entire life and not have enough money to buy a Bible because it takes a lot of work. Like, not only the work of handwriting, but just the work
Well,
of producing.
But you don't have to get to a historical discussion in order
Yeah.
to say that images are a legitimate way of telling stories.
Right, correct. And yeah, so yeah, and that's kind of my point. It's like this is how people interacted with the faith is through these images, and these images were telling stories. And I was telling John last night when we were like having our preparatory discussion about how there's a difference generally between the East and West in iconography, in that in the East there tends to be a lot more focus on individual saints. Like there are storytelling icons in Eastern churches as well. So like I'm not saying, oh, East is all saints and West is all stories. It's just the individual saints are a lot more important in the iconography of the East. And like I used to wonder why that is, but like I figured it out. It's because they're pointing you to these people and especially to their stories. Like you can relate to their stories because in their stories you can see examples of virtue, example of the sort of life that you ought to be living. So it's like I see an icon of, let's say, Saint George, and here's this man that was a Roman soldier and lived a life of privilege, and was like right hand man to the emperor himself, but is willing, like at the last, like when it counts, to like throw that all away and take a stand and say, no, I'm a Christian, and die. It's like, well, encountering stories like that has a much different effect on your way of thinking than being told, well, this is what a Christian should do, this is the kind of person a Christian should be. And like being, because like I feel like what you're left with if you're not relating to the faith through stories is like you have to come up with a whole bunch of lists.
Mm-hmm.
You have to come up with a whole, like you have to like be very well prepared and like rationally, I don't know, like have this, like I said, this big list of things. Like, okay, here's what I do in this situation. Here's what I do in this situation. Here's the sort of things I ought to be thinking. Here's the things that are good, and here's the things that are bad. But it's like if you instead have lived your entire life hearing stories of Christians and martyrs and saints and all these things, it's like you don't need the lists.
Yeah.
Like you don't need to figure it all out. Like it becomes like stories become a part of you in a way that I don't know, like lists and definitions and standards can't.
This is why somebody might kiss the icon of a saint, or this is why you might have a pillow at home with a picture of your past loved one on it, and you might grab the pillow and hold it like this. It's the exact same thing. You are relating to it through the story of them, through the experience of them.
Yeah, but it's also like there's a way in which when you're doing that, those people and their stories actually become a part of your life,
Right.
in a way that's like, I don't know, like that is why we teach our children through Bible stories instead of saying, hey, 8-year-old child, read the Bible. And it's like, we can all think of kids who are like, were great at memorizing their Bible verses, but then when they grew up, it's just like,
What did they even
doesn't mean anything to them.
So this reminds me, what you just said, David, reminded me of a video clip I saw once back in, I think it was back in the 90s. Oprah Winfrey had a church group on that was basically teaching young children how to preach. And this young boy, who was probably about 11 years old, was like really good at preaching. And they brought him on the show with the church group and everything, and we're telling him, preach. He started preaching and quoting Bible verses, and Oprah said to him, "What does it mean?" And he had no answer for her. And he had, in other words, he only knew memorized knowledge, he had no relation to it. It had no meaning in his life because there was nothing to relate to for him other than shouting a bunch of phrases and techniques and things like that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to go back because there's something that you were saying, but I just wanted to put a couple of pieces really clearly together. And I apologize to anybody in the audience who this was like painfully obvious for me to come back and restate. But you said that you felt like you had a relationship, or you have a relationship with your great grandfather because of stories. And then you move into talking about images of saints or stories of saints. And you said, well, here's the problem with iconoclasm. Here's the problem with getting rid of all those visual stories. But you could also say, like, of getting rid of the idea of the saints in general. It's like what that offers to you, what those stories, what those people painted on the wall offers to you, is a type of relationship with the saints. That is the same type of relationship that you're talking about. I can have this with my great grandfather. Well, I can also have this type of relationship with Moses and with John the Baptist, and you know, like with John Damascus or whatever. Like I can have the same kind of connection with them, and from that one, I can just take a sort of comfort in that. You know, I'm thinking of the great grandpa thing, and like thinking of like what in that translates. But like one is this. I don't know how to explain why that's comforting to think of having a relationship with your great grandfather, but I would say, like, just on a bodily level, it seems like that's part of it, is comfort.
Yeah.
Part of it is I understand myself better, and so that goes back to that identity formation that I'm talking about. If I know my great grandfather, and if I have a relationship with him, then there are mysteries of myself that I'm able to unlock, and there are like good things in myself that I'm able to live out. Through that understanding. And I say understanding, you know, you could say through that knowledge or whatever, but it's the kind of knowledge that comes through storytelling.
Right. Then there's also the question of, like, what kind of person am I, and do I choose to be, and what sort of actions am I going to take in the world? And like those are deeply, deeply informed by the stories that you connect with.
Right.
So like you're talking about your daughter relating to these stories, and Aaron's talking about similar things. It's like a big thing I'm getting from this is like you're recognizing how these stories are shaping them as a person, and how that's going to inform the decisions that they make. And like this is something that goes like well beyond.
It's like it is the story, and it's the telling of the story, and it's the storyteller. It's like all those things are shaping. It's not really just the story in isolation. But for shorthand, you could say the story is shaping. But yeah, go ahead.
Right. Like it's something that goes well beyond like the fairy tales and the children's stories and the Bible stories that you listen to as a child. Like it's also like this is like essential to the nature. I just stopped saying like. This is essential to the nature of Christianity, is that Christianity is something that has meaning, and like the reason we fuss over certain things that, you know, some people say are insignificant, like, oh, why do you care how you define the incarnation of Christ? How do you, like, why does it matter to you how you define the relationship between his divine and human nature?
Well,
or why does
you can say that Christianity is the ultimate story, and it contains the ultimate symbols, and that means it leads to the ultimate identity transformation. Like you get the greatest identity that's possible through your relationship with the Christian story.
Right. Yeah, and it's like if you understand that, then you understand like it's also important to have the correct story. Because if I start changing the details, you can argue, oh, those are insignificant details. It's like, well, but they're not actually, and it's not because
you might say, like, from a technical way of defining terms, you might say, like, well, that doesn't help me with my technical definitions, or you might accuse You
Yeah,
know,
and
like
that's
ancient Christians at these different councils of like, oh, they're just splitting hairs over these fine
yeah.
technical issues. Well, they're not. They're not interested in the technical details. They're interested in getting the story right.
Yeah, but they're also interested in how it manifests. So if you like, let's say,
Right. Yeah, that's what it means to get the story right. Is
yeah, let's say
tell
look,
the story in a way that leads to the positive transformations. And yeah, but go ahead.
yeah, like look at the example of somebody like Saint Maximus the Confessor, who, like in his day, his bishop and a lot of the bishops in the East had adopted what is now considered a heresy, and he stood against it. And you might look at it and think, okay, why are you so concerned with this technical thing? And he actually explains it very well. It's like, it's not a technical thing. This is going to deform the way that you relate to God, and by extension the way that you relate to the world, because we're not talking about definitions that pertain to the rational mind. We're talking about meaning. We're talking about story. We're talking about how you perceive everything. And this is why it's vitally important that we, like, not me so much as an individual, but we as a society, we as a church, hold on to the right stories.
There's a type of story. If I can change the subject a little bit here, there's a type of story that is really uninterested in getting the technical details right, and that at one point was basically the most popular type of story, and in the modern world, like, we've totally discarded it and dismissed it. And this would be hagiography,
Right.
or the lives of saints. And if you are at all familiar with like medieval hagiography, then you will see all kinds of stories about people slaying giants, or
Right.
like these crazy miracles, and like these strange islands that people travel to, and like all kinds of things that are obviously not technically accurate. And again, those were actually the most popular types of stories. So like I took an early English literature class in college from a really, really good teacher. I mean, the best teacher I've had in any subject probably, and who was a scholar of medieval literature. And we barely mentioned hagiography. We didn't read any. We read The Dream of the Rood, which is sort of similar, but anyway, that's like, there was one story that's like, oh, I guess it's kind of leans in this direction a little bit, but for the most part, it wasn't even part of the discussion. Because if you're a scholar of medieval literature, then you basically take the position like, even though this hagiography stuff was the most popular literature, that's not the stuff that we're going to study, because it doesn't persist into the present day. It doesn't seem to shape the consciousness of the modern world and the way the modern storytelling works. So like you kind of come up, without even realizing it, you come up with a way of dismissing hagiography.
Right.
But like I say, it was hugely important, and not interested in getting those technical details right. And I'm going to hand that over to you in just a second to discuss. Not interested in getting the technical details right. Interested in, nevertheless, a kind of personal transformation.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, like, I would interject there that this is going to be controversial to a lot of conservative Christians, but the Bible is also often not concerned with getting the technical details right. It depends on which book you're talking about, but for the most part, what the Bible is focused on is meaning, and not like scientific accuracy.
Well,
And that's that's almost inconceivable to a modern mind.
just to add
Right.
to what you said there about the Bible not often getting many details correct or whatever. What happens now, though, many times, is when the modern rational mind reads the Bible. Oftentimes, what starts to happen, or what will happen in the discourse in a
Yeah.
Bible study or whatnot, is, well, I wonder if they did this way, or I wonder if they did that way.
Right.
When in fact it does not matter at all. We're not even able to comprehend what the story itself was pushing you towards, and towards
Yeah.
what the story was challenging you to think about and learn from it, and instead of
Yeah.
well,
So
I wonder if they wore Nike sandals or Adidas sandals.
Yeah. But it's also like Protestants wind up removing like a huge portion of the book of Daniel from their Bibles because it's too weird.
Mm-hmm.
Like the story of Bel and the dragon. It's like originally from the book of Daniel, but it's like this deeply mythical type of story. It's like, oh, this is obviously not a historical event that happened. It's like, yeah, you're right. It isn't a historical event that happened. It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be a story.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and it's always interesting to hear.
it probably is a historical event that happened, but it's just being told in this, I don't know, symbolic way.
In a mythic mode.
Yeah, and like the same way, like I mentioned the story of St. George. It's like, well,
Like
in the
Balaam's
West,
donkey is one,
Yeah,
like
right.
for a lot of people, this is a story that's like, okay, this
This is
obviously
ridiculous,
disproves
I
the
get it.
Bible. Like
Yeah.
this disproves all of Christianity because you have a talking donkey in a Bible story.
yeah, and then people try to come up with like these hyper rational ways of explaining it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you don't need to explain it.
C.S. Lewis would disagree with that, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, right. Well, it's always interesting to hear like the way that Jonathan Pajot talks about this particular issue because he'll say like he'll stand by the miraculous description and say like, look, I'm not arguing against this stuff technically happening. What I'm saying is that the reason that this story is told is not to recount the technical detail. The reason that this story is told is because of the meaning of
Right.
what's happening here.
Yeah,
And if you're going to get caught up in the technical detail and say like, did this happen? Did this not happen? Then you're looking at something other than the actual purpose of the story.
Right.
yeah. So like the story of St. George in the West morphs from this story about the Roman general defying the emperor, which was Diocletian, by the way. He was Diocletian's right hand man. It morphs from that to he slays a dragon.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, because he did slay a dragon. Like that's what he did.
Yeah.
So it's a very natural progression. It's like a dragon is not a dinosaur.
Mm-hmm. No, it's also interesting. Like slaying dragons is a very common story in
Right.
general, but
Like
there are a
all
lot
over
of
the world.
there are right. Well, and it is especially something that comes out of like the Mesopotamian tradition.
Yeah.
But you have stories from like all different time periods of Christian missionaries traveling to pagan lands
Right.
and slaying dragons.
Right.
And that story is recounted over and over again, whether you're talking about like
It,
Eastern Europe or England or South America or whatever. Like
yeah.
like saints are constantly slaying dragons.
It should. We should say just a little bit here. It's very complicated what it means to slay a dragon, and there's no one thing that you can say. Oh, slaying a dragon is a symbolic way of saying this. It's a symbolic way of saying lots of different things.
Yeah.
Right.
But what you could say like well, you mentioned like he did slay a dragon.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you could say, well, if you understand what a dragon is, then you would understand that the story is telling
Yeah.
the complete truth.
I mean, yeah, like just in the same way, like Daniel slew a dragon, like he
Mhm.
did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a thing that he did. Maybe
Yeah.
not in the most literal
Material, yeah,
sense.
right.
I guess literal in the most literal sense, but not in the most material sense.
Yeah, right.
Um,
Now, I feel like our conversation is going to go on really long.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a really fascinating topic. There are a couple other things that I want to touch on before we wrap everything up. And one, I did mention epic storytelling as a topic that I wanted to at least mention here.
Yeah.
And there's really one point that I want to make on this, and we can riff on it a little bit, but like I say, I suspect we'll want to wrap up soon. When we talk about epic storytelling, or if you learn about epic storytelling in school or something, then you may hear that an epic story represents the cultural hero or represents the ideals of the culture. And this is it's a true claim, but it's kind of like okay, I guess when we come to the multiple choice question on the test, then I'll circle that option. It's like it doesn't seem like it packs a lot of punch to say like, oh, this represents the ideals of the culture. But what it means is that epic stories were not written stories.
Mm-hmm.
Epic stories were stories that were told by a storyteller, and they are like you were talking about stories being for children, sort of especially, but also being for everybody. epic stories are for young men especially. And
Right.
they're also for everybody else, but they're especially for these people who are like, well, I'll go ahead and use the term adolescents, even though that's kind of anachronistic. But like you could say they're for adolescent men. And what's happening when an epic story is being told is an older man is telling a younger man, this is what I want you to be. And then they tell it in a story, they show it through the actions of the hero, and the young man hears the story, and he picks out elements of that he says, that's what I want to be too.
Yeah.
And then he rises up to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to mention that again because that's like generally that is the function of stories, or at least good stories. I mean, I don't think that's really the purpose of modern stories. I think the purpose of modern stories has a lot more to do with critiquing any kind of ideal.
Yeah.
But a traditional story is about saying it's about an older person saying to a younger person, here is a vision for your life. That's what storytelling is.
But still, you have to ask the question: why is it that the people who are wanting to push up a certain agenda on our culture are using stories to do so?
Mm-hmm.
It's because stories are more powerful than any other tool,
Mhm.
and they know that.
Yeah.
And it's something I think a lot of Christians have forgotten. Which is why, like, for a long time, Christians just kind of abandoned entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
Which this would be like a nice segue into introducing our ambitions if we wanted to. I don't know if we want to do that now.
I mean, if you want to make a couple comments, then fine, but
yeah.
just a little.
Yeah, just a little. Like we do want to, I guess, kind of in this channel or in this I don't know, organization, move into more, like, we're going to continue what we're doing right now, obviously, this podcast, but also move into more storytelling. I won't say too much about that now, because there's still a lot of details that need worked out. But like we are serious about this thing about storytelling being more important, and we want to act on that.
Right. Absolutely.
And make that a major part of what we're doing, and like really contribute to the lives of Christians through good stories.
Yeah.
That includes like the classic stories of saints and heroes and martyrs of the faith, and other things as well.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably enough to say for now.
Okay.
Just kind of throw that out there and tease it.
I'll touch on just a couple other things related to epic storytelling, and then I'll be ready to wrap up when we get through with this.
Yeah.
I mentioned epic stories represent the cultural ideal, and I feel like I need to clarify this just because in our postmodern world you have this sort of skepticism of the ultimate ideal, of having a cultural ideal or anything like that. But an epic story not only will represent the ideal, but will also represent where it falls short. And so there's actually an epic story resists giving a simple vision that's saying like, hey, here's the vision, and if you live this out, then life is great all the time. And then the other thing, I mentioned these being stories particularly for young men, and I mostly get this idea from Joseph Campbell and for other people that kind of critique Joseph Campbell's ideas. And he's the guy who wrote The Hero with 1,000 Faces, that was really influential on story structure in Hollywood. People have loved it. George Lucas, in particular, kind of catapulted this hero's journey into prominence.
Right.
So what people say about Joseph Campbell and the idea of the hero's journey is that the stories that he was studying were specifically epic stories, and they were, people would say, descended from initiation rituals. And I don't know if descended from is a perfect way of, I don't know if that's a perfect phrasing, but for the initiation ritual is for a young man that's on the cusp of adulthood. And you put the young man through some kind of trial, through like a symbolic death and resurrection, would be a typical characteristic of it. And when he comes out on the other side of the ritual, then the community recognizes him as no longer a boy, but now as a man. And as a man, there's a certain way that you're supposed to be in the world.
Right.
And so the epic stories, the ones that Campbell was studying and basing his model off of, like I said, I don't know if descended is the perfect way of saying this, but we'll say that they had a close relationship with this
They
idea
were
of
derived
initiation.
from it.
Well, yeah, but I don't know if to me that's a chicken and egg kind of
Yeah, right. We don't
kind
need
of
to-
issue.
We
Like,
don't need to get into it.
but anyways, I say it just because there is also a connection between story and symbol and religious ritual.
Yeah.
And like when you participate in the rituals of the church, you talked about
Right.
About icons earlier, but when you participate in the rituals of the church, you are participating in a story.
Yeah, right. And it's like that's why ritual is important. And it's like the rational Christianity wants to say, oh, ritual is just all superstition or it's all pagan. Like the one thing you can, and like this might be controversial to a modern audience to say this, but to an early Christian audience, it's absolutely not. That one thing the pagans understood very, very well was the importance of story and participation in those stories. Like Jewish culture also is
Well, that's what your life is participation in a story. And if your life is not that, then your life is aimless and you're depressed.
Right.
Yeah, and so if you're going back to Second Temple era Judaism and the immediate, like the religion that is the foundation of Christianity, like in every way you can imagine, it's a very ritualized culture, and it's not like in this sense that we're just doing everything by rote and we're somehow gaining everything by participating in these rituals. It's that no, their entire worldview was that there is an overarching story. Like, this isn't me extrapolating this. Like, they say this directly, that there's an overarching story to reality. And the more you participate in that story, the more you're in line with it, the more you yourself are good as a person. Like, you are being shaped by your participation in the story. And early Christians pick that up and say exactly the same thing. Like, read the writings of St. Justin Martyr, for example. It's like he hammers that idea. And just this idea of participation. So like ritual and story and iconography and all of these things, they're all different manifestations of this same thing. And you can say it all goes back to story and meaning, how we interact with meaning. So like the liturgy, the prayers, and everything of ancient Christianity, the whole point is you
just say the whole point is to become like Christ.
Correct.
But I mean, there's a process to that.
Yeah, and also like they're saying this is how you become like Christ, by participation in Christ's story.
Yeah.
By participation in the life of Christ, like, and just there's this deep opposition in Second Temple Judaism, in ancient Christianity, to this idea that you're going to accomplish that rationally.
Right. Yeah.
Like you're gonna accomplish that by I don't know, like there's like this dichotomy of doing that exists. Like there's the one hand the doing in the sense of participation in the ritual life of the church, but then on the other hand the sense of doing, as in doing all of the right things in terms of action, or not doing the bad things. But these are like, we would describe both of these as doing or as works, but they're vastly different ideas, kind of, in terms of meaning. And like it's so centrally important in the minds of everybody in the ancient world.
Part of the difference is like one type of doing is like you're accomplishing something and you're gaining credit to your name or something like that. But
Right.
Another type of doing is like is rooted in receiving.
You're right.
And if I participate in the life of Christ, you could call that doing and you could call that works. But like if I participate in the story, then what I'm doing is I'm deliberately doing things I'm spending my life in a certain way where I will receive an identity from outside of myself.
Right. Yeah, like one is to accomplish something, one is to receive something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And like we should also point out that both Christ and Paul in the Bible strongly criticize the one and strongly uphold and commend the other.
Yeah, I want to mention Paul really briefly because I did say something about older examples of rational discourse, and I threw Plato in there, and Plato actually was a great storyteller and somebody who dramatized ideas rather than.
He was also apparently like a professional wrestler.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. But anyways, like I say, in some ways he's a horrible example because he is always he's not doing rational discourse. Actually, he's dramatizing ideas.
Yeah.
I mean, his rational discourse is something like the three of us going back and forth. You know, it's like something very different than me sitting down and saying, "Here is what I believe, and you should believe it too."
Yeah, like he.
But then also, like, to not spend too much time on Plato because he's not really the topic. But I also threw Paul in there to say, like, Paul is, you know, maybe Paul's writings seem more essay-like than other parts of the Bible. And yet, maybe also that's a kind of a misreading of
Yeah,
what
I
Paul's
really
saying.
think that's just a weakness in how they've been translated into English, more than anything. I don't know. That's a big thing to go into. But that's kind of where the position I stand.
It's a big topic, but
That's kind of the position I stand on now. Is that the modern English tradition of translating Paul is just atrocious.
yeah,
It's like disconnected from who he was and the culture he lived in.
yeah. And so would you just throw out as a teaser, like maybe Paul is doing less of like providing the groundwork for rational theology,
Yeah,
and maybe is doing something more mystical and symbolic.
yeah.
To try to tie a few ideas together.
Well, he's speaking in metaphors like constantly.
Yeah, right.
And that's lost in translation, and so you think he's saying these really dogmatic statements, and he's just not.
And then to kind of work toward conclusion and tying some of these things together, I think there's a major problem of meaning and purpose that people struggle with today. And you know, I think of it in particular in relation to young people and people going through school, and like, my life is totally meaningless and all these things people are asking me to do are totally pointless. And as a society, we're trying to figure out what is the nature of this problem and how do we address this. I think in some ways, describing it as a meaning crisis and as a problem of purpose, I think is accurate. But I think really central to the issue is, you could say, like, we're suffering from an identity crisis. And because if you have an identity, if you know who you are, then you don't have to worry about like, what's the meaning of my life and what's my purpose, because like your identity provides that for you. And you know, I mentioned already, like, the greatest identity is going to come through the Christian story.
Yeah, but then that's also closely related to the idea of like why we have the stories of saints, and like why this is like a part of the Christian tradition. Like Paul probably even mentions it in the Bible of why we have patrons.
Well, and what do all those stories of the saints have in common? Is they have all of those people participating in something.
Yeah, but also the idea that I'm getting at is just the sense that this story in particular is one that I connect with and is shaping me as a person.
Right.
Right.
Well, and to get to what you were just saying there, John, we have a crisis of meaning and purpose. Well, we also have a crisis of, I would describe it kind of like this, a fear of participation, because of the overwhelming sense of rationality that exists within the way people have been programmed to think. There's a fear of participation, because you might be doing something, you might be participating in something that might be wrong in some way, or not, the details might not be right.
Well, yeah, and like in our world, before you can participate in something, you have to understand it completely. You've got to have a total rational map of it, and then once you assent to all of it, then you can participate in it. But not before, and you would never arrive. And that's you'll never rationally understand anything.
That's like extremely sad, because no one actually lives their life that way.
Well, so sorry, you're not done.
Yeah, if you participate in a relationship with someone, whatever type of relationship it is, there's no way you can know exactly every single detail about the other person. There's no way you can exactly understand everything about them. but yet you participate in a relationship with them, and that relationship starts to bear fruit in your life and their life, even though rationally everything doesn't make sense, or you don't rationally understand everything about them.
Yeah.
No one actually lives their life that way, but yet when it comes to our relationship with Christ and the church, we are constantly funneling ourselves into that type of approach that we can only participate unless we absolutely understand everything, and only, can rationalize it before we actually participate in it. And it's, like I said, it's sad, because it's like an overwhelming, you could almost say like an evil spirit that prevails over our age in many ways, and holds people back.
Right.
I read A.W. Tozer didn't have a lot of formal education, and put a lot of effort into educating himself, and I read this phrase that he read Shakespeare on his knees, and in that, like, there's this, I think, strong sense of what we're trying to get at with this storytelling discussion, is that when he's engaged in the story, he's trying to receive something that comes from God. And in that line, it's something from Shakespeare. It's not a Bible story or whatever, but it's like, that's the nature of great stories. Is they give you a vision, again, for like what type of person to be and what type of person to not be. If you read the story on your knees, then like there's an openness that, like, this thing is, I'm going to allow this to speak to the deepest part of myself, and I want it to do so in a way that's pleasing to God.
Right.
There is a great power in storytelling, and the power that exists in storytelling is the antidote to the problems in our world.
Right. Like there's this very closely related concept, and I'm just going to mention this briefly. This might actually be something we want to talk about more in detail. Both what he's saying now, and then like what is closely related, is that we also have like a deep fear, I would say, especially in modern Christianity, of holiness. Now, we've made the mistake of thinking that holiness means like some kind of purity in the sense of, I don't do anything bad.
Some type of ultimate piety.
Yeah, which is not what holiness is.
No, there's a connection. There's a reason we think of.
Yeah, there is a connection.
Anyway, we don't dwell on it. But.
Right. But holiness, like what I'm describing, like it is necessary for me to point out what I am actually describing, is like where the glory of God is manifest, is present. So like if I'm holy, I'm holy because God is in me. And I think I would just briefly mention, like, this is why, like in the liturgy, we come to this statement, like in the anaphora, which is the actual like communion part of the liturgy, where we're talking about all this stuff being holy, but then we come down to this statement, and it's a very, very ancient hymn. It's one is holy, one is God, Jesus Christ. And it's just this statement that all of these things that are holy because of God working in and through them. Like it's not themselves anyway. This is just like, that's a brief description of holiness.
If you are to be holy, then you sacrifice your identity.
Yes.
And you put on the identity of Christ. And in doing that, you also you become like a beacon of that ultimate story for everyone else in the world. So, like, because of the way that you live your life, well, we can relate this to what you were saying about icons, where people can have the relationship with the saint, which means a relationship with Christ. Like,
right.
If you're the holy person, then people can have a relationship with you that leads them to that ultimate identity as well.
Yeah, right. And it's like, I don't want to go too far into that. I'm tempted to, but I need to stay on point, which is that there's this fear of holiness, which is very, very closely related to what Aaron's saying. That, like,
well,
there's a degree.
I mentioned what I mentioned because it's like in part the fear of holiness is the fear of death.
Yeah.
Because it is the death of self and
Yeah.
the laying aside of my own identity and saying there's something
Right.
greater that I'm going to be a part of.
Yeah, and like also what I was going to say along with that is there's a certain degree to which we should have a healthy fear of holiness, because it is what you're describing. Like it is actually a destructive force, and like the Bible is very clear on this, that the holiness of God is destructive, and anything that is corrupt is destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And if all you are is corrupt, then you will be destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's just this sort of fear of holiness that I think informs a lot of our fear of like ritual and holy things, and why we wind up with a world that is devoid of those things. It's because those things are scary.
Yeah. Well, and
But it's at like this deep visceral level that we don't understand. We're not connected to as rational modern people.
and our rationality is one of those is a the rationality of our world today is a great tower that topples
Mm-hmm.
when encountering the holiness.
Well, it's like it's very top heavy without a solid foundation, so it
Yeah.
is unstable and it's going to fall over.
Anything else, guys, before we close this?
There's so much more we could say, but
There is.
Yeah, I mean this is, rational discourse is going to lead to a kind of ultimate existential meaninglessness,
you're right. Which is like
which is where we are, as a society, and
Yeah.
where our kids are. I mean, the youth of our society are in that place.
Yeah.
and I think I would say it's good for us. It's not just okay. It's good for us to be having these discussions that we're having, and even having these deep, like philosophical and theoretical discussions. But they're not going to mean anything to you as our audience unless we root them with the right stories. Unless we
Right.
connect them with the right stories, which is why we need to do that. We need to be telling stories as well. And it's like the three of us didn't come to our positions strictly through rational means. We connect the dots through the stories that we've heard,
Yeah.
or the things that we've encountered.
Right.
And so the best way to make the points that we're making is through stories. But if we're also doing what we're doing now, you'll connect to the things that we've said previously by encountering them in story,
Mm-hmm.
like in actual meaning as it's manifest in the world.
Yeah.
So it's a mistake thinking that you're going to come to these things rationally.
Yeah. John, you mentioned earlier, who was it that you mentioned read Shakespeare on their knees?
A.W. Tozer.
Okay. I guess, unless you have something else you want to add to what David just said.
No.
Okay. In closing, I want to share a little story. Haha. My grandmother passed away this September of this year, 2024, and the year before, in March of the year before, in September of 2023, my father passed away, and then in spring of 2023, another dear friend, elderly lady that I knew, passed away as well. And one of the three most common things that those three people related to me in was all three of them at different points in my life in a very impactful way encouraged me along my challenge of being overweight and trying to lose weight. And the dear lady that passed in spring of 2023, Marcia was her name, on her deathbed encouraged me, noticed that I had lost a little bit of weight, and encouraged me as she was laying there dying. My father walked by me through that his entire life, encouraged me, never stopped. The most impactful story of my grandma in relation to my weight loss was her and my grandfather would travel to Florida every winter and be gone for 3 months or more. And over the course of one winter, which is a miracle in and of itself. Most people don't easily lose weight during the cold months of the year, but that winter I happened to lose a pretty decent amount. When they returned in the spring, my grandma noticed, and the funniest part of that story was that her and my grandpa returned and were saying hello, and grandma was encouraging me, saying, you did well, and good job. And my grandpa was standing there and not saying anything, and grandma kind of chastised him a little bit for not saying anything, and it was that's a funny part of the story. But suffice it to say this, that those three people are no longer living here in the physical life that we live in anymore, but yet they are very much still alive in that representation, and I relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I relate to it, quite honestly, on my knees. In that the words of encouragement that they had, they live on with me. And I said earlier in the talk that is why you might grab the picture or a pillow with someone on it of someone that you love and that's no longer with us, and hug it, or why you might kiss an icon. That is a story that I relate to every day. That's a memory that I relate to. That's an encouragement that is with me to this day. And, that's kind of what we're getting at in the stories that we want to tell,
Mm-hmm.
is how you and I can relate to these things so that we can draw closer to Christ. Because ultimately things like that are what drew me and draw me closer to Christ, is the example of Christ they gave to me, and that encouragement.
Right. And I think we can all think of stories we've heard of martyrs and heroes of the faith, whether it be somebody in Roman times or for us growing up as Mennonites, people during the time of the Reformation that were persecuted, or even modern day people who made these heroic stands for Christ. And there's a sense in which those stories tell us so much more about being a Christian than a lifetime of being taught the right things, being taught what to do. It's you can teach and teach and teach and teach and not get through to a person. But then when that person just sees an example, whether it's somebody right in front of them, like in your case, or through stories, and that's why we tell stories as humans, is because we're teaching our young people, this is the sort of person you ought to be. You need to be like Jesus. That's easy to say, but it's hard for us to actually connect with that, because I don't know quite how to say this. It's almost as though Jesus is so perfect as a human that it's hard for us.
Well,
in a
I
lowly
think part of the difficulty is if the more incarnational your view of Christ is,
Mm-hmm.
the more that you see.
You see Christ in others.
Yeah, right, and the more you see this is a pattern that I can live out.
Right.
And the more that Christ is removed from humanity, the less that you're able to live out that story.
Yeah. And so there's this statement, it's I don't need this, I don't need all these saints, I just need Jesus. It's well,
That is part
that
of
Yeah,
is
there's
what
something inaccessible.
yeah, but also it's that is also precisely what we're connecting to in the saints is
Mhm.
Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm not connecting to Saint Basil as a man. I'm connecting to Christ in him.
right.
And in those stories, like Aaron is sharing, it's there's almost this sense in which you're not connecting to them, you're connecting to Christ in them.
Right.
And because you have those stories, Christ is more real to you
Right.
than if he's just this theoretical person that lived and died 2,000 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, I mentioned incarnational. It's also the more incarnational your faith is, the more Christ lives in those people,
Yeah.
in those saints that you're trying to connect with.
Yeah, which is like this important thing that we connect to in the story, that, you know, Christ lives. He's not dead. And he ascended into heaven. Like, because he lives and ascended to heaven, he is also manifest bodily in all of these people.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's a good place to end this discussion. But we're obviously very glad that you're with us. We're glad that you join us whenever we share these videos and these discussions. We look forward so much to your participation. The comments, the dialogue section is I enjoy it a lot. I enjoy seeing what all of you have to say. And we just appreciate your participation. We look forward to more to come, more of sharing these things with you. Pray for us as we get into some of this storytelling as we've talked about.
You know, I want to add to what you're saying also, is leave your comments, and in the future, we'll incorporate that actually more and more into what we're saying, like
Right.
actually responding to what our, I don't know, I guess you could say our community is saying. Like, we want to involve you more in the discussion as much as we can.
And I will actually right now take the opportunity to address one comment here a little while back on one of the videos. It was from Bonnie. She said, please don't go away. And so we're back.
Because of you.
Yeah.
But yeah, keep up the participation, keep up the prayer, please, and we will continue to pray for you as well. And we love you all, and we wish you peace in Christ.